Hi everyone, this is Mike at BrashMonkey, and this is a long overdue tutorial for how to import and use Spriter files in Construct2. And as you may have guessed, this is what the demo looks like that I'm going to be making. And here it is in Construct2. This is what the layout editor looks like. And these are the events we're going to be going over. This first one on initialized is created automatically by the Spriter plugin when you import a Spriter file. And then we just have these few events here that handle controlling the character and changing the animations and flipping the character depending on which direction he's facing. I should mention at the time I'm making and will upload this video that I'm using a version of the Spriter Construct2 plugin that is not yet released, and it does feature some bug fixes and functionality that might not be in the current version. But that said, no matter what version of the Spriter plugin you have, the first thing you're going to want to do is load up your Spriter file into Spriter itself so you can review your animations and that you have immediate access to the exact naming of every animation. Once this new build of Spriter and the new build of the Construct Spriter plugin are released, you'll see that there is now in Spriter, if you choose Save Project As, you now have two options. You can save as the traditional default scml Spriter file format, or a new file format called scon, S-C-O-N, which is a JSON file format. And for use with the latest build, once it's out of the Construct2 Spriter plugin, you're going to want to export your project, or a copy of your project, I should say, in scon format in the same exact folder. So in my case, that's on my desktop. In this folder, you can see I've already done it. But so there's the original, which is player.scml, and then I would save a version as player.scon, but I've already done that, so I don't need to do it again. And once we do that, and that's saved out in the same folder as the original Spriter file and ready to go, we're going to minimize Spriter, and we're going to go into Construct2, and in this case I've loaded up the version of the demo just before importing the Spriter file. So it's all set to go. If I run this, you'll see that I have the environment all set up, and I have a clean, clear, single-framed rectangle sprite set up for my platform movement, which is very typical in game making. You're actually controlling the character, or I should say the actual sprite you're controlling is just a rectangle, and then you're going to be basically attaching the Spriter object to that rectangle sprite. The rectangle sprite is used for nice clean collisions with the environment, and basically the Spriter object is being used as, you could call it a skin, or the actual visible aspect of the character that's just overlaid on top. So I'm back in the layout editor, and now all I have to do to import that Spriter object is to find it in the folder, and I'm going to click and drag the actual scml file right onto the canvas in Construct2, and it's going to ask me to select an event sheet. Okay, so I pick the event sheet associated with that layout that I want the Spriter object in, and I just click OK, and it just does a little processing, and then it tells me that an event has been added to that event sheet, so I click OK, and you'll see all of these sprites are here now and they're selected, so I can just get them out of the way. And basically everything that's just appeared are all of the sprite images that are used in the Spriter file, as well as an actual, a currently invisible actual Spriter object. And the easiest way to get that out from everything else is to just manually choose it in the objects palette here, and then just change its position to something drastically different, so it'll be really easy to grab and manipulate if we want to. But for now, somewhere off the screen is absolutely fine, because we're going to make an event that will always pin it basically to this this object's position. And if you look in Spriter, all of the animations are built so that basically the hotspot or the 0, 0 point for the sprite is down here at the heels. And if we look at this rectangle I made, I also placed in a similar fashion its hotspot here. So when I anchor the Spriter file to the hotspot of this rectangle, the character is going to be placed in the right position. So now if you have the latest versions of Spriter and the plugin like I do, you're going to want to use this scon version of the Spriter file. And the way to do that is to click on, in the objects, or if you can find it on the canvas, click on the player, in my case, player Spriter file, and then go into its properties, and you'll see down here under properties it says scml file, and then it says player.scml. I'm going to change that to player.scon. Okay, and now we're going to go take a look at the event sheet, and you'll see the initial event that the Spriter plugin itself created when I imported the Spriter file. And then I've created one event that simply on every tick sets the player Spriter file to the position of the sprite that I'm using as the platform movement object. So now if I run it, there you go. You'll see this currently very large and very choppy. Sorry, my frame rate is horrendous on this old computer with when I'm screen recording. But you'll see we've got the character. I can jump, and he's there. And you'll see I haven't used any event yet to set which animation is playing, because by default, once you have a Spriter object in a layout, it's just going to default to the first entity and the first animation of that entity. Now there's one easy way if you don't want the initial animation playing to be the first animation in your Spriter file. There's a very easy way to set that up without an event. You just pick the Spriter file in the layout editor, and then you scroll down in its properties to starting entity and starting animation. And if it's all just one entity, you can ignore that line. But under starting animation, let's say for instance we want its starting animation to be walk, which of course we don't in this case since the player starts off not moving. But let's say for some reason we wanted it to start with a different animation. We just type in the exact name of that animation as it is in the Spriter file. And now when I run this, there he is starting up in the running position, the walking animation. And there's just one last thing I'm going to do in this version of the construct file before I switch back to the one that's all set up, is mention, obviously now that we have the Spriter file always assigned in the proper position relative to this rectangle, we don't need to see the rectangle anymore. And so I would just click on that, go into its properties, and switch visible to invisible. Okay, I've loaded back up the finished version of this tutorial demo, and it's identical except for the remaining events that I've added. Okay, and you might have noticed in the original version that I showed you directly after importing the Spriter file that it was really massive relative to the size of the screen. And the first event I want to show you is the first event I added simply says if the player scale ratio is different than 0.6 or 60% of the full size, then set its scale to 0.6, which is 60%. So let me show you how I would do that again. I just would choose, in this case, add another condition. I would choose system, and I would compare two variables. Then I would pick the player, the Spriter file, and then choose scale ratio, and then is equal to, I would change that to not equal to, and then 0.6. So if for some reason you need to scale your Spriter object so that it's more appropriately sized for your game, then you can do it that way. Obviously, so I'm going to click cancel since I already did that, and then I would simply go in here to the action, choose player, and set scale ratio, which is set object scale ratio, and then just change that to whatever I want, and you'll notice, at least in this current version, flipping in the X and flipping in the Y are in this dialog as well. So not only can you change the scale, but you can flip it horizontally or vertically. In this case, we don't want to flip it, and that's how I ended up with this event here, or this action for this event. And before moving on to the next event, I should mention that in an upcoming release of Spriter, there will be a feature to actually scale the entire Spriter project, including the images that are used. So in this example, it's wasteful if we don't ever need to zoom in on the character and see huge detail. Then it's very wasteful to have a character that's almost twice as big as it needs to be. So once Spriter has that feature in, you'll be able to actually create a scaled version of the entire Spriter project, including the images, down to 60%, so you're not wasting memory and drawing time and stuff like that with an unnecessarily large character made out of unnecessarily large images. So moving on to the next event, you had already seen the equivalent version of this I made in the previous earlier version, where every tick I set the position of the player sprite object to the position of the actual rectangle I used to control the character, but I've added player move in front, and this is a Z order action. And the reason I did this, if you look in the event sheet, I'm sorry, not in the event sheet, in the layout editor, you'll see that I have certain sprites and objects that belong behind the character and certain sprites and objects that belong in front of the character. And I have the Z order properly worked out with this rectangle so that it's in front of this tree, in front of these boulders, but behind these foreground plants. Okay, so it's a lot easier for me to just work out the Z order in a level with this one object, especially with the beautiful Z order bar here. So I can literally just drag it around to quickly check, and if I have a problem, I can just change the Z orders just like that. So that makes it a very fast, easy way to check all my Z ordering without having to actually directly fix the Z order for every last sprite that makes up this character, which would be obviously very tedious. So, going back to the event sheet, that's what this event is, or this action is, and all I do to trigger that is I click on the Add Action, Player, and then down here under Z order, move to Object, and then choose In Front Of, and then choose the sprite and click Done, and that's it. Okay, moving on to the next events. This is where it gets a little trickier because I have sub-events, but it's really not too hard to follow. I'm comparing two values here under the system command, and I'm comparing the vector x of the actual platform movement behavior of the sprite, okay? And if it's greater than 0, that means if the character is currently moving in the direction to the right, okay? So basically, if the player is moving to the right, all right, we're using this set object scale, don't forget, to not only affect the scale, but to decide whether it's flipped or not. So by having this event when the character is moving to the right, in that case it's not flipped, because if we look in the Spriter file, he's facing to the right. So flipped would be facing to the left. So we do not want him flipped, but of course we want to keep him, in this case, scaled to 0.6. So that's what this event does. And what this sub-event does, if he is moving to the right and he's on the floor, then what we want to do is change the animation to walk, which makes sense. If he's on the floor and he's moving, then he's walking in this simple case. So the way we do this is Add Action, Player, and then set animation. and then we would simply, in between these two quotes, we would type in the exact name of the animation as seen in the Spriter file. And we have to be careful. If we have more than one entity in our Spriter file, we need to make sure we're currently on the same entity, which in this case is player. So this dialog does not ask for an entity. It assumes, if you're using this dialog, that you're within whatever entity you are in by default. So anyway, in this case I would just type in walk, click done, and that's how I got that event. And then what I'm also doing is I'm changing the playback speed to this little formula, basically adjust the speed of the animation based on the speed of the walk. So if the character has moderately slow acceleration or deceleration, this is really nice because it makes the speed of the walking the animation match the speed he's actually moving. So the way I did that was just add action, go into set playback speed ratio under animations, and then type in whatever formula I want to control that. And it was ABS, which is absolute value, and then in parentheses, and then it was just a formula based on the vector x of the character, and if you can see here, divided by the maximum speed. So, oops, I've got a problem with my parentheses, sorry about that. Divided by, and then I would choose is maximum speed. There we go, close parentheses, and that's how I got that event, or I should say that action. And this following event and sub-event do the same exact thing, except now it's the vector x is less than 0, meaning the character is moving to the left. So obviously in this case we do want to flip the x-axis, which you can see is set here. We're always setting the scale to 0.6 in this case. And then if he is also on the floor, so he's not only moving to the left but on the floor, then we want to make sure he's playing the walk animation, and we want to use the same exact formula to change the playback speed ratio to this formula which adjusts the speed relative to the actual speed of movement of the platform sprite. And before moving on to the next set of events, I wanted to cover some of the things that were not necessary for this demo, but certainly are things that you should know. So I'm going to go into add action and cover some of these other options. One of the most important ones, if you have a large Spriter file or Spriter project that includes multiple enemies, for instance different characters or characters and effects and enemies all in one scml, you're going to need to set entity quite frequently perhaps. And what this does, it allows you, let's say the Spriter file had multiple entities, like one entity was called player with all of the player animations, and the next entity was called enemy with the enemy in it, okay? What you would do is choose, type in under entity enemy in this case, and then perhaps idle or attack, whatever the animation is you want to play. So basically if you need to switch entities and switch the animation that's being played, that's how you do it. So you switch entity, and then you can also give it the initial animation it's going to be playing once it does switch to that entity. And another important thing that you can control with the Spriter object, let's go in here. There's actually a lot of control you have over the animation. Obviously, like a normal sprite, you can rotate the sprite to any angle you want. But another cool thing is you could set whether or not an animation is looping or just going to play once. And you can also pause an animation at any time and then resume it if it is paused. And then you can even skip directly to a certain specific point in the timeline of that animation, which is a very powerful and advanced feature. So for example, if you had a character or an object that was playing a very long animation, and then an event happened that should basically skip the sprite ahead to a very specific part in the animation sequence, that's how you would do that, and you would just type in the time. So now it's on to the next event. In the case of this event, what we're doing is if the character is not moving to the left or right at all, that's the vector x equals 0. And let me just show you the way I got to that was add a condition. I'm comparing two values, and then I'm choosing the, oh, in this case not the sprite object, I'm choosing the actual rectangle sprite that has the platformer events, and then I'm choosing vector x equals 0, so that's how I got that. And then if it is 0, meaning he's not moving to the left or right, and the animation name of the Spriter object is not currently idle, meaning the idle animation is not playing, and he is on the floor. So basically he's not moving, he's on the floor, and he's not yet playing the idle animation, then we want to play the idle animation. And then we want to make sure we restore this playback speed of the animation ratio to 1, which is normal speed, because setting the playback speed ratio doesn't just affect the animation that's being played, it affects every subsequent animation that you set. So we need to make sure whenever we switch to a new animation, if we don't want to do interesting things to the playback speed ratio of the animation, then we should also set the playback speed ratio back to 0 at the same time we change the animation. So let me just show you how I did the this check for animation name. So I'm going to choose edit, I'm going to choose add another condition, excuse me, and I'm going to go into the player object. Oops, actually, sorry about that. I'm going to go into system, compare two values, and then choose the player object, and choose animation name equals, and then in quotes I put whatever I need. Let's say, for instance, kick or idle. In this case it is idle. Okay, so player animation name equals idle, but in this case we don't want equals, we want not equals. And that's how I got that. Moving on to the next events. These events here trigger changes in animation relative to specific events that are happening to the rectangular platform sprite object. Okay, and the first one is the instant that a jump has been triggered by the player, we're going to change the animation to jump start. Okay, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to insert a new event above so I can show you how I did that. I just chose the sprite object, and you'll see platform animation triggers. These are events very specifically designed in Construct2 to instantly detect when something new is happening to the platformer object. For instance, if it's just started falling, or if a jump has just been triggered, or if it's just started moving, or as soon as it hit the ground, which this is great for when you want to trigger a landed sound effect and make dust clouds appear under the feet of the player. That's great for that. But anyway, that's how I made that event. And then I'm simply doing what I did up there, changing the animation to a new animation and making sure I set the playback speed ratio back to 1. And you'll see here I'm doing the same exact thing in this event, but instead of on the initiation of jumping, I'm doing it on the initiation of falling. So I'm playing the animation false start. And after that, there's only two things I need to do. Jump start is sort of a tween animation to the jumping loop. So after the jump is initiated and I play jump start, I need an event that detects when the jump start animation is finished and start playing the jump loop animation, which is a looping animation. And whether or not an animation is looping or not is defined in the Spriter file itself. Okay, so if you pick an animation and if you look down here and you see this looping icon as orange, that means that it's set to looping. And if you click on that, that turns it off and it's set to not looping. And you'll see it has a very specific effect. There you go, it had a pop there. It'll be much more obvious in the walk animation. Okay, there it is, looping. Now I'm turning off looping, so it pops back to the first frame instead of smoothly tweening to the next frame. And of course, in Constructor, any game engine, if it's not set to looping, then it'll only play once and then stop. Okay, so that's one way to control it. And obviously, in the ideal situation, you're going to have all your animations set properly as to whether or not they're looping within Spriter itself. But if you need to sometimes play an animation and have it only play once and sometimes play and loop, you can actually control that as well. And the way I'm doing that, or the way that you do that, is in the Spriter object itself. Once you've triggered an animation, you can change, you set animation looping, and then you just choose play once or loop, and that will override its default setting in the Spriter file, and it'll loop it even if it was set in Spriter to only play once or vice versa. And I've done the same exact thing with false start, which is a tween from the jump into the fall animation. So that's just an animation that plays once very quickly. So I needed to detect when that false start animation is finished to go into the full looping fall loop animation, and it'll do that until, of course, he lands on the ground, and then these events are going to put him back into the idle or the walking pose, depending on whether or not his vector x is 0 or another number. So basically, if he's moving to the left or right at all, he's going to go right into the walking animation from the jump or from the fall. And if he's not moving at all to the left or right, he's going to go right into the idle animation. And that's it. And those few events not only give you a fully animated Spriter character working in your game engine. There we go. But it's all set up, it's all tied into the actual platformer movement and reacts accordingly to the controls of the player. And that's it. Thanks very much for watching. I hope this was helpful.